Hey, my name is Matt Johnson, and this is the new Sony 50mm f1.2 GM lens. I just got back from filming a multi-day long wedding with this lens, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. So here's a review from the perspective of a wedding filmmaker. But two quick things before I start. First, to save you time, here's my conclusion in case you don't want to watch the full review. In short, this lens is very good, but also a bit heavy and definitely quite expensive. So, if you're okay with the weight and you've got some Beardcoin cash laying around in your wallet, in that case, I think it's the best 50mm that you can buy from Sony. Yes, I said Beardcoin, by the way. It's like Bitcoin, but it's a more stable investment into my facial hair. Anyways, the second thing you need to know for the sake of ethics is that this video isn't paid or sponsored by Sony in any way. They don't even know that I'm making it. I actually paid my own money to rent this lens through my Sony Imaging Pro support membership because I really wanted to use it at this wedding and see what all the f1.2 hype and fuss was about. So, with that out of the way, let me start by saying, for those of you that are not aware, the 50mm focal length is one of my top 2 favorite focal lengths ever. Can you have 2 favorite focal lengths? I do, and my 2 favorite focal lengths are 24mm and 50mm. If you've watched my Sony 24mm lens review, you will know that it is one of my highest praised lenses that I absolutely love, and it's my go-to pretty much anytime that my camera is on a gimbal. Likewise, whenever my camera is off a gimbal as well, I usually have a 50mm lens on it. But here's where things get difficult, because unlike the Sony 24mm, which is just head and shoulders above every single other 24mm lens that I've ever used before, finding a good 50mm that doesn't have any compromises has been more difficult. I've used a lot of 50mm. You're about to see how many I've used. And every single one of these lenses that I've used has had a lot of pros, but also a few cons that kept them from being the absolute best. For example, I loved the size and weight of the first 50mm I ever bought, the Canon 50mm f1.2. But because I was adapting this lens to my Sony camera, I didn't have access to autofocus, and sometimes the adapter can be a little screwy and adjust the f-stop whenever I didn't want it to. So to avoid these adapter issues, I went full manual and invested in a Sigma Art 50mm f1.4, specifically the Nikon mount version. This was years before a Sony E-mount native version of this lens was available. Because the Nikon mount version specifically offered manual focus and manual aperture control with an adapter, this 50mm lens worked well for years, but it definitely wasn't a lightweight setup. Eventually, I switched lenses again, this time to a Zeiss Contax 50mm. Look at this little baby here, which is still a full frame, full manual aperture and focus control lens. Still requires an adapter too, but one of the big pros of this lens, aside from its beautiful image quality, is it is incredibly small and lightweight, which makes it very easy to carry around all day at a wedding. This Contax 50mm has been my go-to, but I've also rented lenses like the Zeiss Milvus 50mm, which I really didn't like due to its quite chunky weight and size. Sony also sent me their new compact 50mm G lens, which I really like, but it was limited to an aperture of f2.5, which isn't quite enough low-light performance for me. And lastly, I've rented multiple times the Sony Planar FE 50mm f1.4 lens, which, for all intents and purposes, is a predecessor to the 50mm f1.2 GM. I didn't hate that Planar 50mm, it was just kind of meh. It was one of the most expensive options at the time at $1,500. It was very large and felt heavy, and with that weight, I was still only getting a max aperture of f1.4. It also felt a bit too clinical and sterile for me, with no flaring or real character. So, there's my history lesson for you with 50mm lenses. I've clearly liked and disliked things about every single 50mm that I've used, and there hasn't been one that's head and shoulders above every other option. But this brings us to the new Sony 50mm f1.2 GM. Is this finally it? Is this the perfect lens? Well, I'll tell you right now, no. I don't think so. But I do think that it gets closer than any lens that I've used so far, save for two critical areas that we will discuss here in a minute. Let's start by talking about the pros though. Looking at the build quality, this is an incredibly well-built Sony GM lens, meaning that it is sturdy, weather-sealed, and it comes with all the fun bells and whistles that normally come on a GM lens, meaning that you get things like an aperture ring on the lens with a switch that can make it clickless, AF/MF switch, and two programmable buttons on the side. It's a bit taller and girthier than the 24mm, and it also includes a very interesting concave glass front element, which looks different than most other lenses that I've used in the past. In addition, this lens is also incredibly sharp, with a punchy contrast and detail that you would expect from a modern Sony lens. But that's not what you really care about. Let's talk about the most impressive number on this lens, that big ol' f1.2. If you've never used an f1.2 aperture lens, there's something magical about cranking it wide open and getting that absurdly shallow, razor-thin depth of field. It's such a unique look that provides so much separation for a subject, and you really can't replicate it any other way. I absolutely love it, and I'm so happy to tell you that even at f1.2, this thing looks so dang sharp to me. Now, one of the main reasons that I wanted to try out this lens is that since I have upgraded to the Sony a7S III, I've been finding myself lured more and more by the promise of high-quality video autofocus. This means, of course, that as much as I've loved filming with my Zeiss Contax lens from 1970, it is definitely a manual focus-only lens. And if I want to autofocus here in the roaring 2020s, I'm going to need to upgrade my lens as well. The good news is, I'm pleased to tell you that this new 50mm GM has fantastic autofocus that pairs very well with the a7S III. I will admit, I was a bit worried because whenever I used Sigma's new 35mm f1.2 lens, I found that wide open at f1.2, that lens would tend to get a bit lost sometimes finding focus, especially if I was transitioning from focusing on something up close to far away. It would just take a little bit to find it. Thankfully, I've not experienced any of that lag with the 51.2, and I found it to be quite fast even wide open. And because it's using Sony's new XD motors, it's basically silent as well, which is a necessity if you want to record audio while filmmaking. Likewise, whenever it comes to manual focus, while this lens is just like Sony's other lenses in that it is focused by wire, for the past couple years now, Sony has sped up the processors in their lenses fast enough that I've not experienced any perceptible lag between rotating the manual focus ring and the lens focusing. Even though this thing has a ton of glass inside, it is not slow to auto or manual focus, which is great. Talking focus breathing now, which is definitely a hot button topic in the Sony lens world ever since the 35mm GM lens, I have two scenarios for you. The first scenario is the real world scenario that I experienced whenever I was filming a wedding with this lens. As I said earlier, when I'm using this lens, I'm usually handheld, so I'm always moving a little bit, and the camera's moving a little bit, and I'm not usually rack focusing a ton because I'm walking with my feet to get into a new position. So because of that, I didn't see any focus breathing. And if you're filming a wedding or another run and gun event where you're using this lens handheld, I doubt you will either. But that leads us to the second scenario, where I put this lens on a tripod and film myself moving back and forth in front of the lens. And with this, you can definitely see that there is some focus breathing. So if you're using this lens handheld the majority of the time, I highly doubt that you're going to even notice focus breathing. But if you're filming YouTube videos, for example, or something else where you have to have your lens locked off, you may be able to see it depending on the shot that you're getting. Now, I did say that there were two cons to this lens, so let's discuss them. The first con is something that you're going to immediately notice anytime you pick up this lens, and that is this lens is hefty. At 1.71 pounds, it's definitely not the heaviest 50mm that I've ever used. I think that goes to the Zeiss Milvus at 2.03 pounds. But whereas Sony has really been pushing some lightweight lenses with their GM line, namely the 24mm GM that's significantly lighter than the competition, with the 50mm GM, you can definitely tell that Sony had to add some glass to hit that f1.2 aperture. That said though, I do think that it's impressive that this lens is essentially the same weight as their old planar 50mm f1.4 lens, but this one's now f1.2. Anyways, I do wish that the 50GM was lighter, but the good news is that, to me, the weight of the lens does not feel unbalanced on the a7S III. It doesn't feel too front heavy, and I was still comfortable filming with it handheld all day at a wedding. Also, I do think it's important for you to look at the competition to Sony right now when it comes to 50mm lenses at f1.2. You look at Nikon, and their Nikkor Z 50mm f1.2 lens is 2.4 pounds, significantly heavier than Sony's 1.7. And then you look at Canon with their new RF 50mm f1.2, and it's also much heavier at 2.09 pounds. I do think this is a consequence of modern lens design, where lens manufacturers are pushing so hard to create the absolute sharpest possible lenses that they can, and they're increasing the weight of their lenses to do it. And this is kind of a bummer to me, because in my perfect dream world, Sony would have been able to make this lens even lighter. Look at the weight of the Canon EF mount 50mm f1.2. This lens is significantly lighter than the Sony 51.2 at only 1.27 pounds. In my perfect world, Sony would have made the weight of their 51.2 close to the weight of this EF 51.2, but that may be wishful thinking for me with the way that lenses are going these days. Or maybe what I really need to be hoping for is for Sony to release a 50mm 1.4 GM lens that would bring the weight down more similarly to their 24 f1.4 GM. I think that would actually be my dream lens, and I would be perfectly fine with trading f1.2 for f1.4 if I could get an even lighter weight. Definitely something to think about. Anyways, the other con for this lens would definitely be the price, which comes in at $1,998 at the time of making this video. And just like how the weight of a lot of newer camera lenses is increasing as camera companies put more and more glass in them to make them sharper, the price of many of these lenses is going up as well. For many years, Sony was kind of known as the expensive lens company, where, for example, Sony was selling their 50mm planar f1.4 for $1,500, while Canon was selling their EF mount 50mm f1.4 for $400. Quite a price difference, right? 4 times the amount nearly. Well, with the advent of all these companies now making mirrorless cameras, they all appear to have taken Sony's lead and said, let's raise our lens prices as well. Sony may be charging $1,998 for their 50mm, but Nikon is charging $2,096 for theirs. And Canon is looking down on these comparably cheaper lenses with a near highway robbery price of $2,299. Wow, can we get some pricing competition that goes lower instead of higher, please? Now, do I think that this lens is worth it? Well, I think that ties into the entire conclusion for this video. And that is, in short, if you can stomach the rather eye-watering price of $1,998, and you are also okay with the extra weight that comes from this lens having enough glass to be f1.2, then I think that this is a good investment. But if the price and weight are making you feel skeptical, in that case, I would consider an alternative like the Zeiss Contax lens that I still love, and I've actually already made a video about, which I will link to up in the corner and down in the description of this video. Of course, though, you will not have autofocusing with that lens, which leads me to another alternative, because I know people are going to be very angry with me if I do not at least mention this lens, and that is the Sony 55mm f1.8, which is a very loved lens by many people, but also happens to be one that I personally have never used. Sorry about that. I've clearly tried a lot of 50mm, just didn't make it up to 55. Get to it eventually. Regardless, a lot of the reviews that I've seen for the 55mm from other people are very good, and considering that it's under half the cost of the 50mm GM at the time of making this video, that 55 should give you a good experience with good autofocus as well. With that, thank you so much for watching this review of the Sony 50mm f1.2 GM lens. If you're interested in watching more videos about Sony, I have a lot of them, including some videos about how to easily film in and color grade in Sony's S-Log 3 picture profile, which I will link to down in the video description below. It will also be a huge help to me if you would consider liking this video and subscribing if you want to see more videos like it in the future. Lastly, if you happen to be a wedding filmmaker like me, I know that I reviewed this lens from the perspective of a wedding filmmaker. In that case, you probably want to book more couples and film more weddings. To help you out with that, I've created a free guide that's going to walk you through some practical steps that you can take right now in your business to book more couples and film more weddings. It's a completely free gift to you. You can download it at the link down in the video description. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.